a father, a stepmother, and an 8-year-old boy who never stood a chance. When police found Thomas Valva's frozen body on a bitter January morning in 2020, his father had one story. But the truth? It was something much, much darker. Because behind the walls of their Long Island home, Thomas wasn't just neglected. He was tormented, starved, forced to sleep on a freezing concrete floor while the people who were supposed to protect him watched, and did nothing. But here's the real horror: they didn't just allow it. They enjoyed it. This is the story of Thomas Valva, the little boy who cried for help, and was met with silence. Please kindly take a second to subscribe to this channel for more stories, thank you. Let's continue. From the outside, the Valva household looked like any other suburban family in Center Mauritius, Long Island. Michael Valva, a former NYPD officer, appeared to be a loving and responsible father, raising his 3 young sons. His fiancée, Angela Polina, presented herself as a caring stepmother, committed to creating a stable home for their blended family. But behind closed doors, their home was anything but loving. Michael Valva had primary custody of his 3 boys, Anthony, Thomas, and their younger brother, after a bitter custody battle with their mother, Justina Zubko Valva. To outsiders, he was a dedicated single father, balancing his career in law enforcement with raising his children. Angela Polina, who had 3 daughters of her own from a previous relationship, moved in with Michael and the boys, solidifying their image as a blended family trying to make things work. On social media, Michael and Angela painted a picture of normalcy, vacations, birthday celebrations, and smiles for the camera. But beyond these carefully curated images, the truth was far darker than anyone realized. Thomas and his brothers weren't treated as children, they were treated as inconveniences. From the moment Angela moved in, she reportedly took an immediate disliking to the boys, labeling them as wild, bad, and disobedient. She complained that they had behavioral issues and insisted they needed strict discipline. The discipline soon turned into outright torture. The boys were starved as punishment, left without food for extended periods. They were forced to eat off the floor or search through garbage cans when they were hungry. If they misbehaved, often for something as small as wetting themselves, Angela and Michael would make them strip down and stand in the cold. Eventually, the abuse escalated to something even more inhumane. The boys were forced to sleep in the freezing garage, a concrete floor with no insulation, no blankets, and no heat. Even as temperatures dropped below freezing, Thomas and his brother Anthony were locked inside overnight, suffering in silence. People noticed, but no one stopped it. There were warning signs. So many warning signs. Teachers at Thomas's school noticed his condition deteriorating. He often came to class looking malnourished, dirty, and exhausted. He would beg for food, stuffing his pockets with whatever snacks he could get his hands on. In one heartbreaking moment, a school staff member overheard Thomas say something no child should ever have to say. "I don't want to go home. My daddy is going to punish me." Social workers were called. Reports were made. But somehow Michael Valva, an NYPD officer, was able to manipulate the system, convincing authorities that everything was fine. The abuse didn't stop. And it would all come to a horrific end in January 2020. Inside the Valva Polina household, fear ruled everything. It wasn't a home, it was a prison, and Angela Polina ran it with an iron fist. From the moment she moved in with Michael Valva and his 3 boys, she made it clear, Thomas and his brother were not wanted. She saw them as a burden, 2 messy, loud little boys who didn't fit into her vision of a perfect family. And she made sure they knew it. Angela Polina wasn't just emotionally cruel, she was calculated. She made every day a punishment for Thomas and Anthony, ensuring they lived in constant misery. If they ate too slowly? Punishment. If they didn't clean up quickly enough? Punishment. If they wet themselves out of fear or cold? Punishment. She dictated the rules, and Michael, the boy's own father, followed her lead without hesitation. "Michael, your kids are ruining this house," she would text him. "They don't belong here. They're disgusting." Instead of standing up for his children, Michael enabled her cruelty. He laughed at her comments, played along, and together they built a world where Thomas and Anthony were nothing more than nuisances to be broken down. At first, Angela tried keeping the boys isolated in a room of the house, but she quickly decided that wasn't enough. In her eyes, they were animals, so she forced them to live like ones. Michael and Angela locked Thomas and Anthony in the garage for hours, then days, at a time. No heat. No blankets. No mattress. Just a hard concrete floor and bitter cold. Angela texted Michael about how much she despised the boys being inside the home. "I don't want these kids in my house. I don't want to hear them. I don't want to see them. Michael, instead of defending his sons, went along with it. We'll make them sleep in the garage. They'll learn. And they did. Thomas, just 8 years old, would curl up on the floor at night, his tiny body shivering in the freezing temperatures. His older brother, Anthony, would try to comfort him, whispering that it would be okay. But it wasn't okay. It would never be okay. The true horror of what happened inside that house wasn't just told through testimonies, it was captured. Surveillance cameras were installed around the home, not for security but for control. One video showed Thomas struggling to stand after being locked in the freezing garage. His little legs were weak from the cold, his body barely functioning. Angela watched the footage and texted Michael. He looks like a f***ing zombie. Michael laughed. Another set of messages showed Angela growing angry that the boys had soiled themselves. Angela, they peed themselves again. Clean it up. This is disgusting. Michael, I know. I'll handle it. Angela, make them sleep in the garage again. I'm done with this sh*t. Michael didn't argue. He never argued. Punishments weren't just physical. They were psychological. Angela and Michael starved the boys, using food as a tool of control. If Thomas or Anthony disobeyed, they weren't fed. They would watch as Angela's daughters ate full meals while they were given scraps, or nothing at all. At school, Thomas would scarf down food like he hadn't eaten in days. Sometimes he would stuff his pockets trying to save some for later. Teachers noticed. They reported it. But no one stopped it. When Thomas cried, he was mocked. When he asked for warmth, he was ignored. And when he begged for love, he was told he didn't deserve it. Michael Valva, ***, a police officer, a man sworn to protect people, ***, laughed at his son's suffering. One of the most disturbing videos captured inside the house showed Thomas, weak and freezing, collapsing to the floor. Angela? She watched coldly. Michael. He joked. He's hypothermic. F***ing idiot. The words of a father mocking his dying child. Angela smirked. She didn't care. Because to her, Thomas wasn't a child. He was a burden. A problem that she was slowly getting rid of. And by the time help finally came, it was too late. This case is horrifying on so many levels, but here's the big question. Who was truly the driving force behind this abuse? Michael Valva was their father, he had the power to stop it. But instead, he laughed at his son's suffering. Then there's Angela Polina, the stepmother who saw Thomas and his brother as nothing more than nuisances. She pushed for the punishments, called them disgusting, and showed zero remorse. So what do you think? Was Michael Valva the true monster here, or was Angela Polina the real mastermind? Some say Michael was just as much a victim of Angela's manipulation. Others believe that, as a father, he had the ultimate responsibility, and there's no excuse for what he did. I want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know where you stand. January 17, 2020, the night that would end in tragedy. It wasn't the first time Thomas had been forced to sleep in the unheated garage, but this time the temperatures outside had dropped to a deadly 19 degrees. Thomas and his older brother Anthony had spent hours locked inside, wearing nothing but thin pajamas. No blankets. No socks. No mattress, just the cold concrete floor beneath them. They huddled together for warmth, their little bodies shaking from the freezing air. And just beyond that garage door, Angela Polina and Michael Valva sat inside their warm home, comfortable, fed, and completely unmoved by the suffering they had caused. At some point during the night, Thomas's body started shutting down. He was losing heat fast. His hands were numb. His breathing was shallow. He tried to speak, but his words slurred. Angela and Michael could hear the boys through the surveillance system. They saw them on camera, curled up on the floor like abandoned animals. Angela's response? Indifference. Michael's response? Mockery. Angela, he's gonna be ***king hypothermic. Michael, he's fine. He just needs to learn. Thomas was dying before their eyes, and instead of rushing to help, they laughed. By the morning of January 18, 2020, Thomas's body had given up. He had been in the freezing cold for at least 16 hours. His tiny frame couldn't take it anymore. Michael walked into the garage and found his son unconscious, face down, wet and barely breathing. At some point in the night, Thomas had lost control of his bladder, one of the final signs of severe hypothermia. Michael didn't panic. He didn't even seem concerned. Instead, he dragged Thomas inside like a piece of furniture, dropping him onto the carpet. Michael, ***king. He peed himself. Now I gotta clean this up. Angela stood there watching. No urgency. No attempt to help. Just disgust. At this point, Thomas was barely clinging to life. His heart was slowing, his lips were blue, and he wasn't responding. They still didn't call 911. Michael was a cop. He knew what hypothermia looked like. He knew his son was dying, and he knew what would happen if EMTs saw his frozen body. So, instead of calling for help, he tried to cover it up. Michael and Angela carried Thomas's lifeless body into a warm bath, trying to heat him up before paramedics arrived. But it was too late. At 9:40 a.m., after wasting precious time, Michael finally called 911, putting on his best frantic father act. "My son fell in the driveway. He's not breathing." He didn't mention the garage. He didn't mention the cold. It was all a lie. When EMTs arrived, they immediately knew something was off. Thomas's body wasn't warm from a bath. It was cold to the touch, stiff and unresponsive. His lips were blue. His skin was pale. His core temperature was just 76 degrees. That's when reality hit the first responders. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a fall. This was neglect. This was torture. They rushed Thomas to the hospital, but there was nothing they could do. At 10:28 a.m., Thomas Valva was pronounced dead. You'd expect a stepmother to be devastated, to break down in grief. Angela Polina? She felt nothing. When detectives questioned her later, her main concern wasn't Thomas. It wasn't Anthony, who had also suffered for years. It was herself. She asked, "Am I gonna get in trouble?" Not, "Is Thomas okay?" Not, "Did we do something wrong?" Just, "Am I gonna get in trouble?" Even after his death, Angela Polina felt no guilt. And Michael? The father who was supposed to protect his son? He continued lying, insisting that Thomas had simply fallen outside. But the evidence would soon prove otherwise. When paramedics arrived at the scene, their first instinct wasn't just to save 8-year-old Thomas Valva's life. They suspected something far darker. His body was already freezing, the signs of hypothermia impossible to ignore. But as they worked to stabilize him, they couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of neglect, of a child who had been left to suffer far beyond any reasonable explanation. Doctors at the hospital didn't hesitate either. The more they examined Thomas, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a tragic accident. Thomas was a victim of severe abuse, physical and emotional, and the injuries he bore weren't the result of a single incident. This was a pattern. His tiny body showed signs of trauma, bruises that told a story of years of suffering. It was clear now, someone had failed him in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. The question hanging in the air was, who? Michael Valva, Thomas's father, was the first to face the heat of the investigation. His reaction was chilling. Instead of showing grief or panic over the condition of his son, Michael remained eerily calm, almost detached. His responses to the police were cold, calculated, as if he were merely reciting a script. He claimed that Thomas had fallen in the snow while walking to the bus stop, but that story didn't sit right with the investigators. Why had the boy been outside in such dangerous conditions, in just his pajamas in the first place? And why was there no sign of immediate care or urgency when he was found? As the investigation unfolded, the police learned more about the dynamic between Michael and his fiancée, Angela Polina. Angela, who had only entered the picture a few years prior, wasn't a passive bystander in Thomas's tragic fate. She was complicit. Surveillance footage from their home painted a disturbing picture. It showed Angela walking into the house with groceries, all while Thomas lay dying just a few feet away, left alone to suffer in a freezing garage. What kind of woman could ignore the suffering of an innocent child? But the real bombshell came when investigators uncovered Angela's texts. In one exchange, she referred to Thomas in a way that made her feelings clear. "He's just trouble. Always complaining," she wrote. There was no compassion, no concern for his well-being, only disdain. The chilling nature of these texts was impossible to ignore, and it wasn't long before the investigators connected the dots. Michael and Angela weren't just negligent, they had actively contributed to Thomas's pain. As the investigation continued, the police pieced together a grim picture of a home where love was absent, and abuse was not just tolerated but encouraged. There was no safe place for Thomas, no escape from the torment. And what made this case even more heartbreaking was the complete lack of accountability from those who were supposed to protect him. When the case went public, the reactions were swift and furious. The community, shaken by the unimaginable cruelty, wanted answers. How could this have gone on for so long? There's a haunting thought that lingers after learning about Thomas Valva's last moments. Could it have been prevented? Could someone have noticed the signs earlier? Thomas didn't just die from the cold, he died from a lifetime of neglect. a lifetime of being treated as less than human. As the investigation drew closer to its tragic conclusion, one thing became painfully clear: Angela Polina's role in this tragedy couldn't be denied. She wasn't just a passive observer, she was an active participant in Thomas's suffering. And Michael Valva? He was no less guilty. What do you think? Was Michael Valva as complicit as Angela Polina, or does he deserve some degree of sympathy as a father? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you're as outraged by this case as I am, make sure to subscribe to Silent Weekend Crimes for more true crime stories, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our latest videos. The courtroom fell silent as the jury returned with its verdict. Michael Valva, the man who was supposed to protect his son, was found guilty of second-degree murder and endangering the welfare of a child. The weight of the decision was felt by everyone in the room. As the judge read the sentence, a sense of finality hung in the air. Michael Valva would spend 25 years to life in prison for his role in his son's death. The justice system had spoken, but the pain of losing a child could never truly be erased. For Thomas's mother, Justina Valva, the verdict brought a sense of justice, but it did nothing to heal the unbearable grief. She had been fighting for years to have her son safely removed from his father's custody, only to have her worst fears realized in the most horrific way imaginable. She had warned authorities, she had begged them for help. But the system had failed her and Thomas in the worst way. The finality of the verdict felt hollow because Thomas was still gone. His laughter, his bright smile, those memories would never be enough to fill the void left in Justina's heart. Angela Polina, Michael's fiancée, faced a similar fate. She was convicted of second-degree murder and 4 counts of child endangerment. The court viewed her actions with utter contempt, as they should. Angela's role in Thomas's death wasn't one of passive neglect. It was active, intentional. She stood by, cold and unfeeling, as a child suffered and died in the very house she shared with his father. The evidence against her was damning. The surveillance footage, her cruel text messages, and the complete lack of remorse or empathy all pointed to one undeniable fact. Angela had played a pivotal role in the tragedy that unfolded in that freezing garage. Her sentence? 25 years to life in prison, the same as Michael's. But the aftermath wasn't just about the courtroom. For Thomas's surviving siblings, the trauma was far from over. They had witnessed horrors that no child should ever have to see. Their lives, already scarred by years of abuse, would never be the same. They had lost their brother, and in some ways they had lost the parents they once knew, replaced by monsters in their minds. The emotional toll on them was profound, and the path to healing would be long and painful. And then there was Justina, Thomas's mother. Her heartbreak was unimaginable. She had fought tirelessly for custody of her children, but the system had failed to listen. For years, Child Protective Services (CPS) had been involved, yet nothing had changed. Red flags were raised time and again, but the warnings were ignored. Thomas's school had also failed him, turning a blind eye to the signs of abuse. Teachers had noted his bruises, his unkempt appearance, and the stories he told about his father's cruelty. Yet, no one intervened in a meaningful way. The authorities had dropped the ball, and the system that was meant to protect children had let Thomas down when he needed it most. Justina would spend the rest of her life trying to come to terms with the fact that, despite her best efforts, she couldn't save her son. She couldn't change what had happened. All she had now were the memories of a boy who had been full of life, joy, and potential, taken too soon by the hands of those who should have loved him most. The story of Thomas Valva is a painful reminder of how the systems meant to protect the vulnerable can often fail them. The case raised critical questions about how authorities handle reports of abuse, and why so many warnings were ignored until it was too late. In the end, Thomas's story is one of unimaginable suffering, but it also serves as a call to action. A demand for better protection for children and greater accountability from those who are supposed to keep them safe. What do you think could have been done differently in Thomas Valva's case? Should CPS have acted sooner? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to hear more stories like Thomas's, make sure you subscribe to Silent Weekend Crimes, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Predators don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear badges. Sometimes they walk free for far too long. Thomas Valva's story is an unbearable tragedy that has rocked so many of us to the core. But more than just a sad tale of a life cut short, it is a stark warning about how easily child abuse can slip through the cracks. It's easy to point fingers and lay blame, but what we need to focus on now is how we can prevent future tragedies like this one. The signs of abuse aren't always obvious, and unfortunately, not everyone knows what to look for. But there are warning signs that should never be ignored. Physical injuries, like bruises or cuts, are often a clear sign that something is wrong, especially if they seem to appear without a reasonable explanation. In Thomas's case, it wasn't just the injuries that stood out, it was the emotional withdrawal, the way he seemed to distance himself from others, the signs of fear and anxiety when his father was mentioned. Teachers, neighbors, family members, and even friends, we all have a responsibility to notice when something isn't right. Thomas's school had a few key moments when they should have acted. His bruises, his withdrawn behavior, and the stories he shared about what was happening at home were clear indicators that something needed to be done. But those red flags were ignored. CPS had multiple chances to step in, yet nothing was done to protect Thomas in time. The key takeaway from this case is that child abuse often exists in plain sight. It's up to all of us to educate ourselves about the signs and take action. If you notice something suspicious, don't stay silent. It might not be enough to simply call the authorities once. It's important to follow up and ensure that action is taken. We can't bring Thomas back. We can't undo what happened to him. But we can honor his memory by learning from his story, by speaking out when we see something wrong, and by ensuring that the systems in place to protect children do so more effectively. Thomas should be here today. But the people who were supposed to protect him did nothing. If you found this case disturbing but important, make sure to subscribe to Silent Weekend Crimes. Because these stories, they deserve to be heard.